Hello and welcome to the Leading Lounge. I'm your host, Dr. Justin Dubose. Here in the Leading Lounge, we talk with today's leaders and unpack lessons learned and being learned from a career of leading and communicating in their field. These conversations are designed to be both informal and informative, and we want to equip you with wisdom and tools to empower you as a leader where you are and where you want to be. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 29 of the Leading Lounge. This is our next interview episode of this season, and you're in for a treat because today I interview not only a good friend of mine, but a guy who's very wise, very experienced, and just full of knowledge based on not only an expertise as a military officer, but also just a lot of faith. A guy who has lived his life by faith and is a great example to follow. So John Goldsworthy was my guest for today, and John is a chaplain in the Army Reserves, a full bird colonel, 06. He now lives and serves out in Hawaii, and his journey was one that started in ROTC as an infantry officer. So he went from ROTC to become an infantry officer, had deployments as a commander in his early career, and then later found the Lord and felt like the Lord was calling him to be a chaplain. And he shares the story of how he wound up in a chaplain's office and really felt like, this was God giving me a new direction. And so he became a chaplain. And since then, it's really been a walk of faith because all the things that he's wanted to do in his career, go active duty, all these things, God has kind of kept those from him and kept him in these other roles. And I personally am thankful for that because that's how I met him as an Army Reserve chaplain. And so John has gone through Ranger School, and he talks about that. And now he juggles multiple leadership roles in both an Army context and then as leading a bunch of volunteers as a director of religious education out in Hawaii. And we actually had quite a time getting this interview off. We tried it a few times, and one time there was an active shooter in his building, and they were on lockdown. And anyway, and he shares that story too. But John's a wonderful man, great family. Really appreciate your time, John, being willing to share some wisdom with me. So whether you're from a military background or not, whether you're from a ministry background or not, there's a lot of wisdom here that John shares with us. So listen and be blessed. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining in for another episode of the Leading Lounge. Today I have a special guest, John Goldsworthy. John's a chaplain out right now in Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. And we originally, John, we're going to do this interview last week, and you got in like an active shooter situation, and so we had to kind of postpone it. So anyway, I'm glad you're all right, and thanks for giving me some of your time on this. What's for you a beautiful morning, for me a beautiful afternoon.
That's right. Aloha. And I'm blessed to be able to spend this time with you, Justin, and do ministry. And yeah, exciting times in Hawaii. Nobody was hurt on the active shooter. Turned out to be a paint gun. And so real good training for the MPs and thousands of people involved in the lockdown.
There you go. Any situation, I guess, can be redeemed, right? It was good training, great training. Shooter on post, but hey, great training. So
that's right. That is an Army thing, right?
Yeah. Oh man. Well, John, I'll just start off. I'll ask you the first question that I ask every guest I have, and it just gives you the opportunity to kind of tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got to Schofield Barracks. But it's just tell us about yourself and your professional journey that got you to where you are today.
Yeah, I think that without getting too into the details and spending 30 minutes, it's funny how life goes on. Like, wow, that happened, and next thing you know, you're almost 50. But I've been very blessed and thankful for the journey that I've been on, and always wanted to go in the military. And my family was all Air Force, and when my eyes weren't good enough to fly, said, well, I want to go in the Army infantry and jump out of planes and do the Ranger thing. And so that's the path I chose, and went to ROTC at Washington State University and commissioned as an infantry officer. And through multiple attempts at Ranger School, was finally successful from a miracle, and deployed to Iraq as a company commander. And in between Ranger School and that deployment, actually out here in Hawaii in 2005, I had a experience with the Holy Spirit, where pretty much I started feeling pressure about maybe switching to chaplaincy. And it's like, no, that's not going to happen. That's not part of my plan. But there was this pressure enough inside my mind, enough to where it's like in a prayer in the morning, I just told the Lord, like, well, listen, if you ever wanted me to do something that drastic, you're going to have to give me a kick in the butt, God, like something more than just I
famous
arrived.
last words.
Right, exactly. And he did that very day. I was late getting my security clearance updated. I was lost at the USERPAC headquarters. If you've ever been out there, it's an amazing maze of different levels and floors built into a hillside. In a building that was supposed to be condemned years ago. An interesting story about that. But as I went down this hallway going, this is where the G2 is. I know it. Walking fast, and I got to the door, and I look up, and it says U.S. Army Chaplain's Office. And right then and there, between that coincidence and the Holy Spirit came down on me, and it was an experience to where I knew that God was real and called me to be a chaplain. And I walked into that office pale and shaking, and some lieutenant colonel chaplain's like, "Can I help you, Captain?" and I told him, "I think I've just had an experience." And he's like, "Well, sit down." And then it was off to the races. I deployed. I stayed in the infantry for 3 more years, and then the second part of my life has been doing ministry. A lot of it trying to become an active duty chaplain, but not in the cards. The Lord has kept me at service in and out of active duty. And in the process of that, I have been a pastor for 4 years. Then I went active duty for a while, and now I'm a director of religious education. And it seems like he's got me on a plan where I'm learning different areas other than just active duty Army chaplaincy, which is what I want to do. But he hasn't allowed it to happen for some time. And so that's where I'm currently at right now, as a director of religious education here in Hawaii.
Gotcha. And still in the reserve. Still, just for those who are listening and don't know, recent promotion to full bird colonel, and got yourself a slot out there on the island somewhere, right?
Yeah. They've transferred me to 18th MedCom.
Okay.
And I'm right passionate in learning about what does Army chaplaincy do in case of large scale combat operations. That's a Army acronym. They call it LSCO. And so that's in my wheelhouse right now, is how can we be faithful chaplains in the case of God forbid, a large war that would happen out here in the Pacific.
Okay, gotcha. Well, so how old were you so you were a captain, so you're junior level officer, but I mean, like late junior, but how old were you when you went in that chaplain's office?
I think I was 29.
Okay.
Yeah, or 28. Yeah. So no, it's 2005, so 29.
Gotcha.
And then it's funny how that happens, because we get callings to do things, but then God has a long journey to prepare us for what he wants us to do. So it was another years before, well, no, it was about 8 years before I actually became a chaplain.
Okay. Man. Yeah, that's right. Because you and I first met at the captain's career course, and you have all these captains, and up shows this 05 lieutenant colonel chaplain.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, this guy must have come into the game a bit later than the rest of us.
Yeah. Yep. I tried to redo my rank with the Army and go back to as a captain, but they said, yes, we'll do that. They call it re-scrolling. And then it's like, nope, we won't. JAGs review it. Always JAG, messing things up,
Mm-hmm.
messing dreams up anyway. And so they said, nope, you can't do that. You got to stay as a major at the time.
Okay.
And, and one real quick thing, Justin, is this is God's providence at work. Right when this is about 6 years of trying to become active duty, I get a phone call saying, "Hey, we will accept you back active duty from the chaplain's office in the Pentagon." And it was right. It was within the month that I had been promoted to lieutenant colonel,
Oh,
and
wow.
so he's like, "Well, sorry, we can't do anything for you then. If you were a major, we could have taken you back." So by that time, I had just laughed and went, "All right, God's got a plan, and he'll do his thing and ask me to work hard from what he gives me."
Yeah,
So
for sure. Well, and I'm biased, but I think the very best chaplains are in the reserves. That's what I think. They stay there. They make a career. They figure it out. But no,
yeah.
God's will is different. And yeah, I'm sure as we go through these questions, the non-active duty experience, I'm sure has helped shape your leadership in a lot of ways. So I want to touch on, John, one of the things you mentioned pre-chaplain life was going through Army Ranger training. So it's a pretty prestigious thing. Not many people, get to wear all the stuff that comes along with graduating Ranger school. You do. And so I was going to ask you, one is kind of a two-part question. One is, what was the hardest part about the Ranger school for you? And then the second part is, how did that whole experience help prepare you for future leadership roles? And that could be chaplain ministry, non-ministry, but just I'm sure that there's all kind of stuff that happened there that God used to prepare you for
hmm
stuff in the future. So can you share about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good question, and so I want to joke around and go, it's the not test. The not test was the worst part, but that's only for knuckleheads like me that aren't good at knots. So uh, sorry, the phone beeped, and I want to make sure I still got you. Okay, so the hardest part of Ranger School, I think, was failing.
Hmm.
Difficult place. You're exhausted and you're hungry, and you really gotta want it in order to succeed. Otherwise, you're just gonna quit. You're gonna be like, "This isn't for me," and then you find a way to quit or get injured or whatever. So you really gotta
Hmm.
want it. But I went to the end of Florida phase and thought I was going to graduate. And they said no on patrols. I failed patrols. And I got recycled after I complained about how my hasty ambush was really good and everyone thought it was good. But there could have been some subjectiveness there. Um, Either way, I was no goat and sent back. And then my second phase of Florida, um, I was dropped. I got two no goes on patrol. To my Well, I have to admit, I put on polypro when I wasn't supposed to on a very cold night, a cold rainy night, and an RI caught me the next day and fired me on the spot, which I think had something to do with being conveniently never given another patrol again after that.
Hmm.
Uh, so I learned about following rules when I thought they were really stupid.
Right.
So that was something I learned. But the biggest thing with all of that struggle and all of that work and effort and goals is I failed. And that was very difficult for me. I don't think that I had a morning that I woke up for months afterwards, Justin, where that wasn't the first thing that came into my mind.
Man. And
Uh,
were you recycled twice?
yeah, so you need a spreadsheet to track my Ranger School adventure. And I don't know if you have time. on this podcast. If you can do the math, I went through every phase 3 times, but yet never recycled Darby once. So it would take a spreadsheet to do that. But this particular time, the second time that I went back, I went all the way down to Florida and recycled once on Florida and then was dropped.
So
And then
for dummies like me, what is Florida? What does that mean? Like, is that towards the end?
yes, yeah,
Okay.
that's the third and last phase of Ranger School. You have the first phase that's Woods, Darby, and then you have Mountain phase, uh, and then Florida phase.
Okay, gotcha.
And yeah, and so they said, "Hey, go to your unit and learn and come back." And there was a period of growing and humbleness. And even though I was a Christian at the time and prayed for God's hand and blessing, I think the Lord showed me a certain amount of idolatry that was going on, wanting that tab.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest thing going into part 2 of your question is I started learning how to become who God made me to be versus who I wanted to be
Right.
in the eyes of others.
Which is a very important distinction.
Boy, yeah. So an example, the first time I was going through Ranger School, I was a team leader. And I remember I was a brand new lieutenant, kind of cocky, chip on my shoulder, trying to be this, war god, hero, leader, what I wanted to be,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you got to have a little bit of that to work hard for that. But if it's overboard, there's something I think God's in the business of correcting if he
Right.
loves you, disciplining, whatever you want to call it. And so I remember getting on the case of one of the guys in my teams. He was a Ranger Battalion guy. We called him Bat Boys. And I remember showing him on the map as a team leader, hey, here's where you're at, and then spot checking him. Hey, do you know where we're at? And he didn't know. He was tired.
Mm-hmm.
And I got his case, and he looked at me, and he's like, Goldsworthy, you're such a prick. And he said that. And I'm like, and then I went away and, went off to my next thing. But that always stuck with me because I never thought of myself as that. I just thought of myself as being hardworking and,
Yeah, you're just a squared away guy.
Right. And trying to do what everybody else is, try to be an infantry guy, all of that.
Yeah.
But that always stuck with me. And I remember by the time I went back to Ranger School, I had a better balance in my mind. I was more mature. I was more secure in myself.
So was that Goldsworthy, you're a prick, was your first go round at Ranger School?
Yeah, that's some of that. Right.
Okay.
Yep. And yeah, that's a good, to quantify it. Yeah. And then so I went back and I had made up my mind, hey, I'm going to work really hard for this, but this isn't everything. This isn't my life. And I really submitted it before the Lord and said, hey, this has been a goal of mine, but here it is. And help me, Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was much different, the successful time. I made it straight through. I didn't recycle, thankfully. There was a bona fide miracle in Mountain phase where I was way back on major minuses, and I had a burst of energy that got me a major plus from a RI, a ranger instructor that never gives them out. But it was kind of a Forrest Gump moment where I called for fire, was a medic, carried somebody off an ambush line, all these things where it was like, anyway. But so I really thought the Lord just gave me energy to get out of Mountain phase, which was honestly my worst and toughest phase.
Mm.
But the key to this was I went in, Justin, with a heart where I'm like, I'm just going to help others. I'm going to just love the heck out of people, lead the way I'm supposed to. And this was before I was called to be a chaplain, but leading and serving and helping and being part of a team where it's not all about me and my success.
Yeah.
And I remember, if you want to quantify it into one phrase going from Goldsworthy, you're such a prick, is there was a time when there was a guy stuck in the mud up to his waist, and we were exhausted, and the patrol was still moving on. And I remember going back to him, and another young enlisted guy from Ranger Battalion, Bat Boy, which those guys are great. I came to really like them. At first, I didn't like them because they're so full of energy and they're cocky and young and they're Rangers and all that. But I remember he was stuck up to his neck, and I just took my weapon, grabbed it by the barrel, my M4, and reached it out to him to grab hold of the buttstock to get him out of the mud. And we struggled for a while getting him up with all his gear and his rucksack. And I just remember him looking and going, man, Goldsworthy, I love you. Thank you. You know, and I might have missed that the first time going through. We're supposed to help each other, but I might have been so busy on my, trying to be successful in the world's eyes. I might have just said, somebody else is going to get him out of the.
Tough luck for that guy. I'm marching on. Right.
Not my problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that right there, I think, is the biggest thing God taught me. Failure versus success is be yourself. Focus more on others than yourself. And I had to be taught. It's something I couldn't have read out of a book. I had to go through a lot of suffering to get there. I would have never chosen to have to go through that place again.
Yeah. It's interesting hearing you describe it that way. I was thinking about the phrase, which I haven't heard before. I just made it up in my head, but somebody else has probably said it. But is that failure is not always failure, and success is not always success. Like your failure is what, led you to success. And if you would have been successful, the Goldsworthy, the prick methodology, then it would have translated to failure later. I mean, you think that's a fair assessment of what you just said?
That's a really good point, Justin. And yes, I think so. I think it would have translated to failure in my lieutenant years. And then, and it wouldn't have helped me later on, even past the success of Ranger School, when I got to deploy and lead a company in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
There were just things that I did that were me, in that leadership, the stress of leadership, where the Army said, hey, you got to do this. You got to carry around a pistol. You got to try to grow a beard so sheikhs will take you seriously. And I just saw through some of the charades of that. And instead, I focused on being who I was. I still wanted to improve, but I focused on being the person God made me to be and working in those gifts and being comfortable in my own skin. And I ended up being a better leader because of that failure experience. And I appreciate you bringing that out in this. That's helping me think about that, rethink about that.
Well, it's interesting as I interview different people. So by the time this episode comes out, unless I change the order, it'll be 25. So you'll be the 25th person I've interviewed for this podcast, and all of it centered on leadership. But it's amazing. I'm trying to think back. I think without exception, everybody I've interviewed talks about failure as basically being a catalyst for success. That they had to go through this humbling, kind of painful process, whether it's in Ranger School or business or some personal failure or whatever, that it's almost like a prerequisite to getting the humility you need to lead well,
Yeah. And it's something we'd never choose because we always think, well, we got it. Or we, maybe in our time with God, we're like, well, help me, learn this lesson the easy way. Or I do know, though, that, and that's such a key to life and having faith and knowing that there is a God that loves you and that the Lord, a personal relationship with the Lord, where I just know that even in those times, those valleys, he's teaching me something and he's with me and he sees the future. And so, one more quick thing back to the Ranger School thing is when I was standing there at Victory Pond and I had finally experienced that success and I was just thankful it was over with. I looked back at that 4-year block and I'm like, I would have never chosen it any differently, even though 3.5 years of that, 3 years and 11 months of that, I would have chosen it differently. But at the end of that 4 years, I would have, I was like, okay, this is what I needed to learn. And then it was like, Lord, help me never forget this
Yeah.
lesson. That
Yep.
never forget it in the times of success or blessing.
Yeah, for sure, man. I tell people now mine was not a military experience. Mine was a church experience. But I tell people all the time that if I would have known what like was involved, and it was probably the toughest period I've had, at least professionally and maybe personally too, just because they're so closely tied in together. But if I would have known what was involved, I would have never been like, okay, Lord, let's do that. Let's go. But on the other end, I'm like, well, my goodness, I wouldn't trade that experience for all the experiences in the world, because that's where like the most learning happened and the most growth and the most, like dependence on God to get me through stuff where it's like, all right, I'm legitimately in over my head and out of my league, and I have no idea what's going on either inside of me or outside of me. So you're going to have to do this thing, Lord. And coming out the other end of that, you just feel like, hey, me and God, we can do anything. I'm just holding onto the rope, and He's just doing it.
Do you remember? And I know you're the question asker, but I have to ask this question, Justin. And so do you remember a time when when God says, "Hey, my power is perfect in your weakness." Do you remember a specific time during that trial that God showed you that?
Well, so there's a couple of different aspects. One is kind of the corporate, not just me personally, but like my leadership in this church setting. And immediately one came to mind, and it wasn't a failure per se, but it was more like, hey, we don't think we can like keep the lights on. The church had gotten in over their head as far as with a loan and payments beyond what we could afford, and God just providentially did it. But I think probably what's interesting, answering your question, is it's not until after I got out of that season where I feel like kind of I was out of the fog a little bit, and looking back into the fog, I was like, oh my goodness. Of course there were those moments, of course there were those moments where I was just so, determined to plow through that I would have never even paused to consider that. But on the other side, and I don't know if that answer even makes sense what I'm saying, but in retrospect, it was like, oh, there was dozens of those all scattered throughout. And I didn't even see it when I was in the middle of it,
It's almost like not a specific miracle moment, but a bunch of little one, or just a pretty much of, hey, just don't quit, have faith, keep stepping, and God will see you through it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very much so. Very much so.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I'm gonna put the question asker hat back on, and I'm gonna shift.
Yes.
I'm gonna shift and ask you a different question. So
He's helping me grow.
Yeah, that's right. See, this is the prerequisite for the Goldsworthy podcast, which is with your last name. You could do all kind of marketing with that. But so you got Sorry, go ahead. What?
Oh, I was just joking back. I'm in Hawaii right now, so I don't have a good enough connection for that, for our phone or video.
One day when
anyway,
you're back in Texas, everything's better over here, to include internet. But I was going to ask you, so you have an interesting contrast. So Army reservists, right? You and I are both in the reserves. You have both a civilian life and an Army life. So in the Army world, everything's super structured. It's very hierarchical. And there's some ways in which I think leadership is not as complicated, or maybe not complicated, as complex relationally, because it's just, hey, I'm rank X, you're rank Y. I'm position X, you're position Y. So go get her done. But like in the real world outside of the Army, it's more complicated because, you have to have a lot more kind of soft skills and persuasion. So in your role now, you're a DRE, which means what? Director of Religious Education?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So your Army is volunteers, right? And so anyway, they're not paid. You have to compel, you have to persuade. You can't just show up and knife hand people and tell them what to do. So I was going to ask you, from your military background, what translated well to that role? Like, what leadership skills are helping you? And then maybe what's been difficult for you where you're having to almost relearn things that would have been great in the military, but actually make leading volunteers more challenging?
Yeah, that's good. And maybe it'll be a lifetime of learning and processing through, because it is different. And that was well said by how you said it. It's so the first part of that question is a military background. It helped me understand having responsibility and having to get something done, and being able to go out and confidently lead or figure out how to get that done and communicate to people. And so that's always been a huge thing, is the confidence, the understanding of what it takes to get something done from point A to point Z, and and then to lead people in order to do that. And then also to be part of a team as well. When you're not in charge, there's many times in the military where it's like, well, I'd do that differently, but I'm not in charge and I'm part of this team. So I'm just going to be a good soldier, a good
Yep.
fellow officer, whatever that might be to get it done. And then amazingly, it gets done. It's, even
Right.
though it wasn't my idea.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, those are all pluses of the military background. The more difficult part is just what you said. It's not as cut and dry when you lead volunteers, or even fellow coworkers that are not in the rigid military rank system. And and I think one of the things that I find myself, I've struggled before in church leadership, and that I'm still working on, is being able to communicate candidly with somebody that you know is not going to call you sir, or you're not calling him sir. Like, so
Right.
there's that blurred line. Knowing that this person could leave or not work for you, for something else. He's not forced to stay there if he's a
Mm-hmm.
volunteer, he or she. And yet still being able to communicate with candidness, I think, and love,
Yeah.
and purpose. And I realized this is strange. Yeah. When I first went into church leadership, I realized I wasn't as confident as a pastor as I was as a company commander.
Mm.
I just, because I know if I would have came across that way, some people would have liked that, but a lot of people that would have turned them off.
Sure.
Um, I mean, church leadership is just not a combat infantry leadership, no matter how much you'd like it to be or what. It's just not.
Mm-hmm.
You're shepherding people, you're loving them, you're spiritually guiding them. So, so my a weakness, I think, would be, if there was a problem. There's two weaknesses, I think, in communication. One that I'm working on personally, and then one that I see a lot of other people doing. So one personally is, there was a problem at a church I worked at, and I saw the problem, and then I was addressing it to another pastor, and I just didn't really get to the point.
Mm.
And and I remember getting feedback like, "You're being so mystical about this." And I look back on that and I think, well, it's because I really didn't want you to take me wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I did not have the faith to be who I'm supposed to be in that and just get it out there. Maybe I was too busy into pleasing man, to where I couldn't say it courageously enough. But and in my mind, I thought I communicated well enough for that person to understand me. So
Yeah.
that's his problem. Uh, but it wasn't. It was me not communicating well enough, or even asking for feedback. I communicated, and then he said, "You're kind of being mystical," and I left it at that. Versus like, "Hey, did you understand what I said? I did not pursue it." Um, and that's something that I'm trying to become better at, is being candid, using candidness in a civilian leadership with volunteers, yet still have lots of love and patience.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
Maybe.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry.
go ahead. Okay, well, I was going to say maybe one thing that really will help me is just being prayed, filled with the Spirit, and really being it. I can be more candid if I truly am for that person in ministry leadership. When things get messy, they always do in ministry, right? In different ways,
Oh,
because we
sure.
all
Yeah.
and we see things differently. But if I really love that person, like God tells me to in the scripture, and I'm really for that person and his dreams and desires, and obviously if I'm the leader, I'm going to, there has to be boundaries there, but I'm going to treat that person like God sees them, not as more of a transformational communication. I know that's a buzzword in leadership, but it'll be less of a transaction and more transformational. And maybe
Hmm.
that will be more candid when I truly love that person and want the best for that person in leadership.
Yeah, for sure. What I was going to say earlier was, let's see, this would have been now 2 seasons of this podcast ago. I interviewed a guy who was actually uh, a previous pastor at the church I'm at now, but he's the director of FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, for Stanford University out in California. And he was
Yeah.
telling me that he said, he was talking, I think he was relaying a story about when he was a pastor, but it's true in his role now. He said, like you have to build up relational capital because inevitably, you're going to say some things where you're going to need to be on the receiving end of people's grace, either because you
Mhm.
say it wrong or, you have to say something hard or difficult or whatever. But if you build up the relational capital, then you can just kind of make a withdrawal. And it's not that your account goes into the red, it's still green. You're just making a withdrawal. But he said, or maybe I don't remember if he actually said this or not, but that without that relational capital that you've built with people, like your volunteers that you lead or whatever, then yeah, it makes that communication really, really hard. But you can say hard things when people know that you love them and you care about them, which, only happens over time. And it's still not going to be easy, but it's at least still productive. Whereas
Right.
I think in the Army, you don't necessarily need, I mean, the relationship obviously helps, but in that super structured, you don't really need the relationship. People are just going to do it because that's their job, and they're going to carry it out the best they can.
Yeah, that's really good, and that's well said. And I think people aren't dumb. They know if this is just a transaction,
Hmm.
or eventually catch on. I'm sure we've all been in those experiences, even leading or as pastors, where we're just so busy. We're just trying to get things done, and then we're like, "Oh, that's like the fifth time I've asked that guy to volunteer to do that." and
Right.
but
Yeah.
asked him, "Hey, how are you doing? How's your marriage?" All of that, right?
Right.
Um, yeah, which makes me think about the busyness of our lives and how we how we lead and how we what we try to accomplish for God and anyway, you've got me thinking and pondering.
Yeah. This will be part A. We need a part B podcast with you and me with all of our ponderings.
Yes. Okay. All right.
that'll
That
that'll be a future episode when you're not in Hawaii. We can do video and everything. But so kind of a follow up question to that, John, is you talked about the communication aspect being something that was different, nuanced, more challenging. So one question, and this podcast has two focuses: one's leadership, one's communication. So one question I like to ask everybody is to tell me about a time when you personally failed at communicating and what you learned from it, and how did it change your approach to communication after that?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the biggest thing that when I fail at communication, it's when I triangulate. And when the communication needs to happen with one person before it goes to a group, but instead I don't have the courage
Mm.
to talk to that person and figure it out. And instead I go to person C, a third person, and vent or figure out, well, what do they think on it? But really my motives are more of I need an ally or support or
Hmm.
or I need to vent. And if this venting is the person is actually involved, it's not like a non-connected pastor or chaplain somewhere. It's not like a confidant or whatever. It's a
Mm-hmm.
person involved in the situation, and that triangulation, I really see it happen too much in the chaplaincy, in the Army in general, in the church. And I'm really working on not being that way, even though it's very human nature to want to do.
Yeah.
Uh, so a specific time that I started picking up on this was it was actually my before chaplain time. We were trying to build up a wall at a JSS, and the first sergeant was tasked to do it. And it just wasn't a very good plan on building the wall. He was busy doing other things, and he was a great guy, great first sergeant. And but I kind of vented to my XO, and I kind of and we're all a team, right? Instead of me going to him and going, "Hey, we need to make this better," I didn't have the courage. I didn't have the relational capital because I was too busy. We were all too busy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I vented to the XO and then also kind of hinted to him like, hey, I want you to fix this in a way.
Mm.
But it went sideways because people aren't stupid. They knew, like the first sergeant knew that I wasn't happy with the plan. Yet he
Mm-hmm.
realized that I didn't have the courage to just talk to him directly about it. Instead, I went to the XO and that hurt our relationship. It didn't boil over into conflict, but I could just tell there was a distance between us.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy, right, Justin? It's so easy to be busy, to rationalize it away, instead of doing the right thing and approach that person one-on-one and communicate, hey, we're not right now, and now we need to get it better, and how do we figure it out, and spend that time to do it.
Right.
That's the hard thing. It's so easy to go to a third person that's involved and fail in the communication that I think the Bible's clear about as well. Like, go to that person before you bring other people
Right.
involved.
Yeah, you're right. It is incredibly common. What do you think it was for you that made you do that? Take that kind of passive, indirect approach, do you know?
That's it was me being too busy, not thinking it through because it was being overstressed. I think even the best leaders and the best people that try to follow Christ, if they're not staying strong by that time, at that time, I was not practicing Sabbath. So there was just all sorts of things where I was unbalanced. And so it was very easy to just skip over that part of communicating, and just doing the natural thing of, oh, hey, here's the XO, or here's past so-and-so. He's right here. I'm going to try to fix it
So
this
in your
way.
case, it wasn't like fear or like almost like cowardice. It was just kind of fatigue and laziness and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's number one. But I think fatigue and laziness brings out fear and cowardice in our personalities.
Yeah.
So I think that was the background as well.
Yeah. I think you're right.
Because we're just more fearful when we're lazy and fatigued.
Yeah.
We're more fearful. We don't realize that God's got this.
Right.
So good question.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer because I think you're right that it is something that's incredibly common. I've seen it. Not something I struggle with as much as I used to, but definitely I think everyone knows that feeling of, I know I should go say something to this person, but what about, or what if, or, what if this happens, or whatever. So the second part of that question, let me ask you that again, John, is just how did that change your approach to communication? So like in your role now, did that particular instance, like, do you consider that or remember those kinds of things when you need to go talk to someone?
Yes. And I think that the distance and relationship and teamwork that occurred made me realize, like, I don't want to do that again. That, and what started once I slowed down enough to process it, which was actually after the deployment, I just started realizing, like, I don't want to be that way.
Right.
As a human being, if I'm in leadership or not, I don't want to be on the side of that. And I also, over the years have just witnessed it in church and in chaplaincy. It's people get in the habit of a good Southern guy I know called it chicken lipping. People get in the habit of chicken lipping and kind of, sizing people up in front of others when they're not there.
Right.
And really when you see through the facade of all that, it's somebody being insecure and wanting to
Hmm.
make their own position better at the expense of somebody else.
Right.
Um, and I just see people's reputations and suffer needlessly. It's just not godly. The book of James calls it demonic.
Mm.
People are self-interested and envious, and it tears people down. And I think people don't know they do it when they get in the habit of it in their
Sure.
communication.
Yeah, I think you're right. And then they have to be either under serious conviction or confronted about it to even realize that it's a thing that is now a regular part of how they, interact with others.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Well,
Um,
John, one more question, and it's always my favorite question to ask. I love asking this to military folks, and I love asking this to missionaries. But it's just about the best story that you got. Okay, so I found out people in the military just have these amazing stories because you're put in these just situations that are just not normal. They're not routine, and so you end up in these places and with these people and in these scenarios where you're just like, what is going on right now? So, just going to ask you, what's the single greatest story that you can share from your, what has it been, 20 plus years in the Army?
yeah. Oh, yeah, 24. And there's a lot of them, and they're so fun. Yeah, I'm so blessed with some of these memories. One that's coming to mind. Okay, this is back in the infantry time. There's a lot of great chaplain stories, but this one's coming to mind. Maybe it's because we were talking about leadership and the Iraq experiences
Mm-hmm.
come up. So, it's a two-part deal, but it's just rich in the way that I'm like, gosh, did I really get a chance to do that and make those decisions? Did we all do that together? So we had a 4th of July celebration, and I got a chance to design. I was a company commander, so you you have an unhealthy amount of power when you're out at a JSS, and when you're in command. And so that shouldn't go on
Sorry,
forever.
just to break down Army acronyms, what's the JSS?
Okay, Joint Service Station. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. And it's pretty much you're just out there in the countryside with the insurgents and the good guys and the populace and all of that, and you're trying to keep order. It was 2008 in Iraq, so that was kind of the nature of the war then.
Mm-hmm.
Was being kind of a police force where you get shot at a little bit more often. But
Hmm.
anyways, 4th of July, and we decided to do these 4th of July games. And we had a lot of fun with it. I got a chance to design it, and you might have to cut this one out of your podcast, Justin. I don't know. One of the events was who could get a chicken on the grill the quickest,
Okay.
and so we had a couple locals bring in some chickens, and we divided up by platoon, and who could get that chicken, that live chicken, caught and on the grill the quickest.
That sounds
So,
like a good Army game.
right, right. This is the main part of the story, but I will tell you that there are some country guys that were amazing at how fast they got that chicken dressed and ready to go for the grill. And none of us Americans wanted to eat the things. We all gave them to the Iraqi army, which was over on the other part of the JSS. They ate it right up. They're good. But anyway, I won't tell you about our HHC platoon, how long it took them to get that chicken ready. And there was, yeah, probably a little bit of suffering. But anyway, so the winning platoon, this was the story where I'm just kind of amazed. So the winning platoon, I just made the decision that they get to stay in at the FOB 2 extra days. Gave them some incentive, and that's like rest time. They're off patrol, they're safe, And so 2 extra days they get to stay off without changing the rotation of platoons, which that meant that there would be a time at the JSS where there was only one platoon there. And
Okay.
so we would not be patrolling. We would just be in a defensive posture. Well, sure enough, what happens when you make that exception? My intel guy came up to me and said, "Hey, sir, we know where this particular bad guy is. I don't remember his name, but we have intel on him. We know where he is. We can go get him." When what you do is you do a cordon, and then you pretty much break down the houses and you make an arrest, and hopefully there's no shooting or anything like that. Um, and he was so excited about this. And I just had to tell him as a leader, absolutely not. We only have one platoon. We're out here in the middle of bad guy country. There'd be nobody left, nobody left to defend the JSS if that platoon goes out and makes this arrest. And oh, he was disappointed. And but I just made the call. No, we're not going to do that. The risk is not worth it. And so we were talking about communication, right? This is just coming out. The intel guy, very talented guy. I've always wondered what happened to him. His name's Sergeant Goodwin. He knew Arabic. He was speaking it fluently by the halfway point of our deployment. Amazing.
Wow.
And I was particularly bad at understanding Arabic. So, and so he was very good at getting intelligence. So he went to the first sergeant. Speaking of communication, triangulation, right? But this might have been a good time to do it because I was being stubborn and just saying absolutely not. And my headquarters didn't know what I was doing, which was kind of on the gray area. But the first sergeant came in and was like, "Hey, sir, we send this platoon out to go get this guy. You can man the radio and the RTO can go up to Tower 1. And there would be 4 of us on the entire JSS, Justin. And if we did this. And I'm like, well, what if this platoon gets in trouble? There's no one to help. We could ask, Alpha Company to have a QRF ready, a quick reaction force ready.
Yeah.
But so much risk going into this spot, that could go wrong. And with only 4 Americans on this entire JSS manning it. I just looked at him, and this was a new first sergeant, and so you tend to be a little bit risk averse when you're a brand new first sergeant. But he just looked at me and went, "I think we should do this, sir. I think we can do it." And I looked at him and went, "Do you realize what we're doing out here in the middle of the Iraqi countryside?" And of course, it's my decision. Like that's the thing. In military, there's you just have a lot of responsibility. It's on you, and it really forces you to pray if you want to do a good job and rely on it. But in my mind, I said a prayer. Didn't really hear anything one way or the other from God. Looked at my first sergeant like, okay, it's my call, and if something goes wrong, it'll be on me. But let's do it. And so, of course, everyone was excited that, we did that. That platoon, the first platoon rolled out of the JSS. And I just remember the very quietness that was on that JSS. I think there's a couple Iraqi army soldiers that we didn't really communicate too much with. We weren't into that. And there was just 4 of us, 3 on the towers and me and the first sergeant back by the radio. So there's 5, I guess. I was like, it felt so strange. We had Alpha Company's QRF just in case. I made a deal with my brother company commander, like, "Hey, don't tell headquarters about this." He got it. And it turned out good. They got the guy. They came back. It was, and there was one person that caught wind of it from headquarters. He just, everyone's so busy they don't really notice. They're just like, "Oh, you got a guy, okay, bring him into questioning." But there was one staff officer, I think he was the S2, the intel guy, is like, "Wait a second, how did you guys get that guy if you have 2 platoons? I don't want to know." So
Yeah.
anyway, looking back on that actually happened, And making those decisions when I was in my 20s, it just makes me have a deep respect for anybody out in a combat zone that has to make decisions with
Yeah.
men's lives and
And it's
and
interesting.
leaders.
Sorry, you mentioned how young you were. It's interesting too to think, you don't feel young at the time, but you're like, man, like a 20-year-old was making that call.
Right, right. You have you have these young men, squad leaders, team leaders that are making life and death decisions
Mm-hmm.
out there in higher stress situations than anybody, in the civilian population make. Younger chaplains that have to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just it has my respect, and so that's a story that came out to me, and I look back on that and go, wow, that's like on a different planet and a different lifetime ago. But I'm thankful that it worked out, and really I'm thankful for the amazing people that I got a chance to work with. Even though it was my decision, it was the people that just did a great job. Many of them a lot smarter than me. All of that I was just thankful to work with them.
Yep. Well, that's awesome, man. Great story. That was fun to listen to.
Good.
Well, hey, I know you got to run, and so I just want to say again, appreciate your time. Thanks for agreeing to come on, share some wisdom, share some insight with me. Ever since you and I met, would that have been 5 or 6 years ago, I guess. Always encouraging to talk to you, man. Always encouraging to see you. So just praying for you in your civilian role and your military role, and maybe we'll have a part B, side 2 episode or something with you and I, or I'm the first guest on the Goldsworthy podcast.
Right. We'll work on the communication of the video. Well, Justin, it was an honor. It was a real honor, and I'm very excited on what you're doing with your podcast and communicating. And let God get the glory. Can I close? I know you were closing. Can I read you the verse that I'm going to read at the promotion ceremony?
Yeah, hit me.
Jeremiah. Yeah. Okay. It's in Jeremiah chapter 9, and this is what the Holy Spirit's put upon me to keep me straight. The Lord's communicated me in order to be a good leader and to communicate well. And it's in Jeremiah 9, and it's verse 23 and 24. It says, "Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, not let the mighty man glory in his might, nor let the rich man glory in his riches." It's so funny how we try to self-glory on stuff. Anyway, the next verse says, "But let him who glories," and I think we all want to glory in this, "that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord, exercising loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. For in these I delight, says the Lord." And that's what he's impressed upon me to live by. Is he's blessed me with a higher rank in the military, that I keep that in mind on everything I do.
Yeah, for sure. Good word. Well, like I said, John, appreciate it, and praying for you with all the different leadership roles you got, and know that your people are blessed from having you. So, and thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of the Leading Lounge, and we'll see you next time.